David Ray. I'm faculty in classics and comparative literature.
I'm Emily Austin. I'm also faculty in classics.
And I'm Stephen Haswell-Todd. I'm an instructional professor in the humanities core.
So all three of us have taught for a number of years in this course that is usually referred to as GRTTT, Greece and Rome Texts, Traditions and Transformations. It used to be called Greek Thought and Literature, and it was actually started by a former humanities dean, not someone in the classics department, who thought that it was important that one of the variants of the core be focused on the so-called classical literatures of the ancient Mediterranean world. And it's not the thought that these are the one body of texts that everyone needs to read, but there is this thought that they are foundational in the languages and communities of the so-called Western world, or the English language and the European world, and therefore in a certain sense they're of interest to anybody who wants to understand those cultures. And in addition to that, these particular texts that we read, things like the Iliad, the Aeneid, the most famous of the Greek tragedies like Aeschylus's Oresteia and the Oedipus of Sophocles, they produce a kind of intimate, sometimes overwhelming personal experience when read for the first time or when read for the 50th time. The thing about Greece and Rome that I think I like the best in regard to the texts is the way that these texts interact with each other. Each subsequent text is written for people in a shared community who are familiar with the previous texts. In order to understand the Aeneid, a familiarity with the Iliad and really with the rest of Greek literature makes a difference. And so students in this core enter into a kind of ongoing, centuries-long, millennia-long conversation, a kind of shared system of meanings and significances.
Which is still ongoing, that conversation, right? One thing about Greece and Rome that the title of the sequence does not necessarily reveal is that we don't spend 100% of our time in Greece and Rome in Greece and Rome. We venture outside those areas both geographically and chronologically. We watch movies. We read modern texts and we watch movies. And talk about the ways in which those are connected to the classics.
So it's hidden in the third T, which is transformations. So and sometimes another reason why we've tried to bring those texts, like the conversation that's generated by those texts, as you said, David, try to bring it up to something more contemporary, is also so that the students can read something that was originally written in English, since for most of them that's the language that they're most comfortable in. So we're reading in translation. We sort of pretend we're not the whole time, but we are, and there can be something, actually a lot of times things get a lot harder when we get to the text that was written in English, because maybe it was written a little bit ago, but it also means you can dig into the texture and the word choices in a very direct way.
It's so special to get to the point in a quarter where we are reading a text in English together, and it becomes so clear that the author in English has also studied the texts that we just finished studying, right? And is interacting with them, commenting on them.
That it's about attention, a reverent attention, perhaps, that it's about practicing reading, practicing talking to one another, embracing the vulnerability that comes with having to put your reaction to the reading into words and put that out there in front of other people whom you don't know that well to begin with, but you will get to know much better over the course of the year, and seeing what comes back at you from across the room, realizing that someone else did the same reading and formed a totally different impression of it than you did, and coming through conversation to understand why, and understand your own reaction better thereby.
This process of conversing with other students in class, in a way, replicates what these ancient texts are doing, models it and mirrors it and amplifies it. As I learn more about what you, Stephen, and you, Emily, think about the texts that we're reading, because we, as instructors, meet once a week and talk, and we continue to talk about the texts. But I get to know each of you better as I learn more and more about how you read Homer, Virgil, Shakespeare, and so on. And that really happens in the class. We get to know each other in the company of these ancient texts.
Yeah, I had a very lovely experience this quarter with two students who had diametrically opposed readings of the end of Prometheus Bound. And so the question is basically, how sad is the end of this tragedy? Is there any hope or not? And one thought there was a little bit of hope, and one really didn't. And they were basically talking about that in every subsequent conversation that they had. It somehow tied back to that deep question. And I can't say these are like special texts that no other text can do this, but it does seem something about the millennia-long conversation and going back to these stories over and over again lends itself to just going. I remember with the Iliad, just ongoing debates with my classmates about whether Hector or Achilles was a more heroic hero. Just like kind of a stupid question. But it was also, for us, very exciting to ask that question, and like, what are your criteria, and or why won't Hector fight from the wall? Why won't he take his wife's advice and not fight out front? And just over and over and over. And they're sort of unanswerable, and that's the fun of it, because they matter a lot, and it engages you to ask these unanswerable questions.
Of course, there are no stupid questions, or perhaps all questions are equally stupid. I think many of our best conversations begin with a stupid question, which then leads to something not stupid.
A good kind of naive question, something like
exactly.
that. Yeah, and that's often the basis of an exciting paper or an exciting project. A thing that distinguishes this core from others, perhaps, is that each quarter is based around what is sometimes called a genre, a kind of literary production. So it's epic in the autumn, and tragic drama in the winter, and then usually comedy in the spring. And reading inside a genre, I think really does enliven and enrich and deepen this process of intertextual reading text together. In other words, it's not just that Virgil is doing interesting things in relation to Homer, or Shakespeare doing interesting things in relation to, say, for example, Seneca. It's that the shared genre becomes a kind of, I don't know how to describe it, a kind of springboard, a kind of set of shared expectations, a kind of shared fantasy world. I'd be interested to hear what you both have to say about how living inside a genre for a whole quarter works out.
Well, I mean, somebody once described to me core teaching as like to think of your class as organized around a question. And so, but that if we're reading within a genre, what ends up happening to me is I kind of have two questions, because I'm wondering what an epic is the whole time we're reading epics, and then also wondering what a tradition is. And then that can build the next quarter, what is tragedy? Epic is like, I don't have like a nice definition of epic, but seeing that they considered the Iliad an epic, and then seeing what Virgil does with it, and then seeing what Milton does with it, it makes you think about relations between like big form stories. How tightly do all the threads come together? Are there like unimportant characters who just die off and we don't care about them? Are there heroes? what are the other questions? Gods, relationship between gods and men, that kind of thing. Those questions all come up. And then with tragedy, what comes up, at least in my class this year, was like the difference between things just being sad and things being like tragic as a quality, and then also tragedy as a genre form, because tragedy is an incredibly thoroughly used word, I should say, in the news. And that's not to say that really, really bad things are not happening in the news, but what do we mean when we say that? And that generated a lot of conversations as well.
Also, we'll see the same story be told in all three of those modes, which really raises interesting questions about what genre does to the story it tells, because you can change the genre without fundamentally changing the events of the story and produce a totally different effect.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that is part of the fun,
Right. I think it's very important for students to understand that as much as we welcome and affirm their prior interest in Greece and Rome and the classics, wherever that is coming from, I think if you are someone who has never encountered classical literature before taking this course, if you are someone who has not studied Greek or Latin, which describes me as well, you are at no kind of disadvantage in the course.